Hi, this is Sara Chapman, and this is my fourth project for the class. This is a research project on 20th century Christian architecture. So Christian architecture is really one of the most abundant subjects of architectural history prior to the 20th century, but we kind of lose it in the 20th century. But churches were still being built, and architects were still designing Christian spaces to reflect changing art movements and modernism. And so this project aims to kind of expose some of the different ways that 20th century architects adapted Christian architecture to new styles and movements. And in total, this project took me about 4 to 5 hours. So a little bit of historical context to start with. So the Catholic Church made some liturgical reforms in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which influenced the way that buildings were designed and spaces were configured. And the 19th century saw the revival of historical styles in Christian architecture, especially the major Gothic revival that happened, and we see St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York that was part of that revival. And I thought this quote was really good in kind of explaining the broad theme of this project, that the willingness of Christian churches to modernize their worship services was paralleled by a willingness to modernize their church architecture. And so I'm going to just kind of use a couple of examples of prominent Christian buildings throughout the 20th century and the different styles that they reflect and different changes that we see in the space as we go through the 20th century. So starting off with the Sagrada Familia, this is in Barcelona. It was designed by Antoni Gaudí in the Art Nouveau style. And the fun thing about this is that it started construction in 1882 and it's still ongoing. But in this building, we see the organic Art Nouveau style reflecting changing Christian attitudes of finding divine power through the natural world. And the natural details also reflect God's creation of the world. And the interior layout, though, still follows traditional basilica plan designs. And so we kind of see a movement away from that tradition with the Art Nouveau style, but still kind of holding true to the traditional layout of the space. And then next we have Notre Dame du Rancé. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but this one we see an even further step away from tradition, although it is still a basilica plan. The church reflects modernist ideals of celebrating materials. So we see all the concrete, we see steel all over with an adornment, which reflects maintaining piety through not a lot of decoration, which is a really prominent theme in a lot of 20th century and even before that Christian architecture. And this was potentially also influenced by Bauhaus principles. And Perret, who was the architect, used modern technologies of lattice work for the windows because he was able to support the structure in different ways. He was able to bring so much more light in and do kind of stained glass in a similar but different way from how it was done in the Gothic period. Okay, and the next church that I'm going to be looking at, this is the Unity Temple, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1909. And this really showcases how modern architects adapted the space. And so this is a church that we see rather than a basilica plan. This is more leaning towards an auditorium style of seating, which becomes really prominent as we move throughout the 20th century and even churches today. So this was especially important in the Protestant church. And even though it is an auditorium layout, Wright opted for straight seating rather than curved, which is something that you see a lot of as well. And another really cool thing about this, and the whole point of a lot of modernist Christian architecture, is really shrinking the gap between the preacher, the minister, and the lay people listening to a sermon or worshiping in the audience. And so we see that in here, where rather than the doors being in the back of the church like would have been normal, Wright actually places the doors back here behind the pulpit. And so then that allows the attendees, the worshipers, the viewers to kind of participate in the preaching space up here. And although the outside of this building is very minimalistic, there's a lot of ornamentation, Wright does actually include some interior geometric detail reflecting the prairie style in here. Okay, and then light was another thing that was really, really important to Christian churches throughout their history, but especially something that they tried to preserve in the 20th century, and some good examples of how 20th century architects adapted this idea of, light kind of representing the divine in the space were these two architects, they're brothers, and we have two examples of their churches here. This is the first Christian Church in Columbus, Indiana. It was built in 1942, and this is the Christ Church Lutheran in 1949 in Minneapolis. Okay, and something that they really tried to focus on was with these designs was to really manipulate shadows through the use of light, especially with just minimalistic details, having a very simple cross at the front that could cast really interesting shadows. And then, especially with the one down here, using new materials that are kind of textured so that the light kind of plays off of them. But other than that, having very minimal ornamentation so that attendees and worshipers could really just focus on this play of light and then having a less distracted kind of spiritual experience. And so in the late 20th century, especially in the 70s to the 90s, you see this big movement in megachurches. And these really took the auditorium idea discussed earlier to an extreme, especially kind of seeing a lot of these like amphitheater type situations where there's a big central stage and then a lot of seating around it. And so the focus with these churches was to resemble more of basic modern office buildings or conference centers rather than traditional church buildings, and then just allowing for more worshipers to be in these spaces, and then prioritizing accessibility, comfort, and then personal worship. Okay, and then this is my last specific example. This is the Woodale Church, this is actually the interior of that building, but this is the outside that showcases more of a postmodern style, kind of reflecting that movement of having a lot of playfulness and nods to historical styles. And postmodernism in Christian architecture really reflects this kind of challenge and confrontation between wanting to preserve traditional liturgy, but also moving on and adapting Christian buildings to reflect changing needs in their membership. And so with postmodernism, it isn't exactly a historical revival, but it also isn't anti-historic. And so we kind of see this fun balance in using a postmodern style with modern Christian architecture, where it kind of nods to an old Gothic cathedral with the spire, but also in a new, fun, modern way. Okay, and then these are just some other examples that I thought were cool. We see kind of a church building in the international style. I think this one is just gorgeous. The structure is very similar to what you would see in a Gothic cathedral, but it's a little bit different, and the materials are just so simplified. There is so little ornamentation. And this is Le Corbusier's famous chapel in France as well. And so we kind of see his fun style and just playing with a lot of universality of the space, not specifically being tied to a certain culture. And then this is another example. This is St. Anne's Church in Germany. And we kind of see this, again, this praise of the material and just a really big focus on that, and then not having a lot of other ornamentation besides just these new materials with the steel and the brick and the glass. Okay, and then just in conclusion, Christian architecture did not end with the rise of modernism. Rather, architects found new ways to balance changing architectural styles, new materials and technologies, and traditional liturgy in the 20th century. Important principles for modern Christian architecture include non-decorative surfaces, the use of space, and incorporation of light. New church architecture reflects changing needs and ideas of Catholic and Protestant worship, as well as changing styles that made worshipers more comfortable in these spaces. Okay, and thank you so much for watching.